Hotep, I'm Dr. Gloria Latimore-Peace, host and producer of OmniU Presents the H3o Art of Life show. The title of this show is Injustice for All. And what we want to talk about is the current state in the communities in Chicago, particularly in the African American communities, of the criminal justice system and the misuse and abuse of police power, the violence that we are subjected to, and in some ways residual perpetrators of. I got that from one of my guests, whom I should introduce right now since I just quoted her. Her name is Patricia Hill, and I know her mostly as the president of the African American Patrolmen's League. Mm-hmm. I hope there is such an organization still in existence. Oh, yeah. Excellent. And then I have Sebamurti Gentry, who is the founder of the SIA Foundation, and he's here in the capacity of father. He is the father of children who are two of whom are in the Chicago public schools, one in the city colleges, and of course he is a civic-minded person, very active in his community, and so is his entire family, including his wife. And so he has a vested interest in the condition of the neighborhoods, not only where he lives, but where his children attend school, because there are a lot of things that happen to children, not necessarily at home on the block, but also when they travel outside of their communities. And I have attorney Lawrence E. Kennon, an old friend, but of course a practicing attorney. Criminal law was at one time his specialty. I don't know if that's the case now. I know that he does still practice, so I suppose in the course of the show I'll find out what all he does besides be a very civic-minded, has always been socially engaged in all of the issues that affect the community, Chicago in general, the African American community in particular. If there's a worthy cause, you will find Lawrence Kennon there. So we want to talk about as many things as we can that impact our communities in ways that we would rather they not. And so I'll start with Pat Hill, because she's been a fighter for our interest for such a long time that I'm sure that you have an opening statement to make.
Well, I'd like to begin by thanking you for inviting me to share this program with you, and it's good seeing you again. Unfortunately, we have to continue to discuss this topic or these issues, but in a way I've come to realize that maybe that's just our purpose at this point, so we have to continue to bring light to them. We are involved in a lot of things as usual. As you very well know, the injustices continue on many levels. Even though I'm kind of stereotyped into this one role as a police person, that encompasses a lot, but also, I've always been civic oriented as well and involved before I became the police. So the African American Police League is still involved. We're part of a coalition now called Black People Against Police Torture. And we're also involved in an entity, it's an ad hoc committee that's dealing specifically with the Olympics, and it's called the Olympic Human Rights Project at Chicago.
Okay, and tell me about what both of those entities do.
Well, Black People Against Police Torture, I am one of the co-conveners, as well as Attorney Kennon and Attorney Standish Willis. We came together in 2007, no, was it 5? I can't remember year, maybe 3 years ago. After the special prosecutor's report was revealed or released regarding whether or not torture really occurred, we knew, but we had to get an official position as a result of John Burge and his henchmen. So the special prosecutor's report, it did in fact state that torture occurred in our community among almost 200 black men, but because of the statute of limitations, there could be no punishment of Burge and his men because time had run out for punishment. So subsequent to that, we decided that we knew we weren't going to get any justice. Our community wasn't going to get any justice. There was not going to be any justice for these families, and there's still at least 25 men remaining in prisons around the country who were tortured. And so we set out to focus primarily on achieving some type of justice for these individuals in our community.
All right, Lawrence, what's your relationship with that particular?
Also and I also want to appreciate your bringing us here. And Pat has been a fighter for all these years. Our goal also was to seek the prosecution of John Burge, as well as to get these others who are presently confined to see if they can be reheard and properly either dismissed out or found guilty or not guilty based on whatever actual evidence there is. I'd like, though, before I get deeper, I was on your show previously, and it was a Family Matters thing. I was talking about my background. And I had gone to both Wilson Junior College and H3o. And I erroneously, I couldn't remember what those two institutions evolved into. And as you know, we had a back and forth on that. And actually, H3o became, became Malcolm X, and Wilson became Kennedy King. I was saying H3o became Milton Olive and Wilson became Chicago State. But actually, Chicago Teachers College became Chicago State. And so I don't want people to think that I was in error either by not knowing, but it was a matter of, I hate to say a senior moment, but it was a matter I had temporarily forgot. So I always want to correct the record.
Well, I'm here to testify to your credibility, and you don't often forget, and you don't often make mistakes. So you may continue now with your...
Thank you.
Okay.
Like they used to say, excuse me, I digress. Yeah, the Black People Against Police Torture is a situation also that evolved through exactly what Pat said, but also there are a number of white groups who are fighting for the rights of black people who have been wrongfully prosecuted or tortured, and against the death penalty and others. And as a distinct black group, there had not been a show of our own force, even though we were just as strongly committed to justice as others, but we had not really coordinated and connected together. So we got together to show that we, on our own force, could be even more involved than others who were seeking the same kind of justice. So we evolved out of that, and as Pat has said, a carryover into that was the Olympics. Because of the torture and there being torture in the city of Chicago, to go into the real background, the consistent torture in Chicago, which was not punished, is equal to the kind of torture that occurs around the world in small countries, third world countries, in China and other places. But usually it's done in a small village. And we claim that the country is not prosecuting that kind of torture that's going on in those villages. On a broader sense, Chicago is the village of the United States. So that in torturing us in Chicago, as far as in a global sense is concerned, we are the village of torture under the guise of the United States, because we are not being vindicated. Justice is not coming down, trickle through the various levels of government, because our government setup is different than that in other places too, but they're also metaphorically the same thing. As a result, what we said was this country has stood out against torture in the countries around the world and have said that the Olympics should not go to those countries that exercise and engage in torture. And in order to be consistent and to have the integrity which we claim to have in this country, then likewise, the Olympics should not come to Chicago, because there is the same level of torture here as is in those other smaller countries, and using the same tactics. As when you saw Guantanamo Bay, the things that were going on there, for instance, are exactly what John Burge and his henchmen were doing to the black people here. And the newspaper keeps saying it's around 100, but that was a 200, really. And as we know, they don't all report what happened to them. So if there's 200 reported, then you know there are more than that that are out there who are either afraid to come out or who said, let's get over it, I don't want to go back into it. So we know that that was a thing that just developed out into our country, and for that reason, as one of the reasons, that we are against the Olympics being in Chicago.
Pat?
No, he hit it. We're couching it under human rights violations because there are 3 actions that cannot occur under the United Nations. They're the violations of the United Nations human rights violations, and they are slavery, genocide, and torture. And so we're saying that since America has been determined through CORE, the Committee to Eliminate Racial Discrimination, Eliminate Racism, Amnesty International, and other entities, Chicago has now been deemed the torture capital of America.
Really?
I mean, you cannot deny it. And so we're using that to say that even though the Olympics does other things, I mean, there is displacement. There are things where within that 2-week period, Olympics only takes place for 17 days. Within that 17 days, there's mass incarceration of homeless people. There's mass incarceration of people just on the street. There are things that are similar to curfew set up. So all of that occurs around the Olympics, but as we move towards trying to get some attention by the International Olympic Committee, which probably would have come to Chicago by the time the show airs, they come April the 2nd through the 11th, is that we want them to understand that just like the protests existed against China, the Tibetans protested because of the torture that was going on in China of those who worshiped the Falun Gong. We are saying in this so-called democracy, see, those are communist countries. People say, oh, that's what they do. Well, in the so-called democracy, you don't commit torture. And so we're saying Chicago, basically, as Larry said, the face of America is no different. And the Olympic Games cannot come to this city. You cannot guarantee the safety of your citizens. How are you going to guarantee the safety of these visitors? Many of them are people of color. And we're also saying that based on how the torture was allowed to go on, during that time, Richard M. Daley was a state's attorney. And there came a time when it was brought to his attention that members of the Chicago Police Department were engaging in torture. It came to his attention via the Chicago police superintendent at the time. He ignored it and for many years said he wasn't aware of it. And to my knowledge, since he's become mayor and that question has been put to him again, he still doesn't seem to be aware of it, but everybody else in the world knows that it's aware of it. And even the special prosecutor's report done by their hand-picked individuals also stated that torture did exist. So on that point, Chicago has to clean its act up. And our motto is that human rights violations and the Olympics cannot coexist. And that brings back memories of Munich in 1972 when the International Olympic Committee did not do certain things when there was an environment, potentially dangerous environment for the athletes. And if you recall, the terrorists came in and killed many of the athletes because of the fact that the country was not stabilized. We're saying Chicago's not stabilized. Many of its citizens are very, very upset. And so that's been documented now. Our organization, the Olympic Human Rights Project at Chicago, conducted hearings on March the 7th. And we conducted the hearings around the 77 designated communities in Chicago. Chicago is divided up into 77 distinct communities. and we invited people to come in and give statements regarding their feelings on the Olympics. We got representation from 41 communities, and it was overwhelmingly against the Olympics. The Chicago Tribune is currently running a poll, and up to date, 26% say yes, we want the Olympics. Somewhere in 70+% said no, we don't want the Olympics. So everywhere you go where you can hear from the people, they're against the Olympics. But when you're hearing from the administration, they're telling you you're going to have the Olympics. But it is totally up against, it's totally determined by the International Olympic Committee. And so we are trying to make sure that they know what our feelings are. Early on, that was one of the strategies that Black People Against Police Torture decided to utilize in raising the issue of torture. So we contacted the International Olympic Committee and the U.S. Olympic Committee by mailing them the 250 pages of documentation of the torture that occurred here. They were in receipt of it, they acknowledged it, and the International Olympic Committee informed us that they would be in dialogue with the U.S. Olympic Committee. I don't know what that dialogue is because we're not privy to it. So they are aware of the fact. And all we really want, which is not simple at this point, that all Daley really can do is just say he made a mistake and we don't need to worry about the Olympics. We need to build Chicago for Chicagoans. We need to get the house in order for Chicagoans. And let's make this a place where people can live and live as human beings. And so we're dealing with it from a human rights perspective, which we think is the ultimate way to go.
You want to, of course, end torture.
Well, of course. I mean, for human beings to live like human beings should live. And that would be, of course, the end. But we want, first of all, there's a series of things that have to happen on this case specifically. Burge has to be prosecuted. Now, he will not be prosecuted for the tortures based on the report that said the statute of limitation had run out. He has subsequently been indicted, but it was for lying on an interrogatory in another case, a civil case of a torture victim. And so he was subpoenaed to come in to give some statements, and within that, he lied. And the U.S. attorney brought him in on that. So he was indicted on that, which is fine with us. Indicted is indictment, and prosecution, and hopefully incarceration is incarceration, because he should pay. The other thing is, as we said before, is the incarcerated victims who are there as a result of being tortured into confessions. The 26 or 27 that are now in the penitentiary, they have to have new trials. Also, what Black People Against Police Torture is doing, has been doing for the last 2 years, we've been working diligently on a bill in the General Assembly, which is now being sponsored by Senator Kwame Raoul. We call it the Burge Bill, but it is the Illinois Torture Inquiry Commission Act. And it basically sets up a commission that will deal with the possibility of any future torture cases where people will have somewhere to go for remedy. And even those individuals who are, those people who are in jail, some of them who are in penitentiaries have exhausted all their means to get some type of redress, well, they can come before this commission. So we know, like Larry said, there are others out here who have never come forth. And it doesn't mean because Burge is sitting on the hot seat that torture has stopped. We know that there are some little Burges around here because they allowed it to go on so long. And so a lot of the police officers who are walking around here every day are eliciting those kinds of tactics, if not those new tactics, but they come under the guise of torture. So for the record, the United States does commit torture. Chicago does commit torture. What we've also found out in hosting the San Francisco 8, when they were here, they were tortured while incarcerated in New Orleans in the 70s. And so they're now, what we're finding now is there's a pattern and practice of this type of behavior among police officers and police departments around the country. We knew that, but now it's beginning to surface. So it's not just Chicago in the United States of America. It seems to be something that people, these officers have been engaging in for some time. And so we want all that to come to light. But in light of all of that, no, it doesn't. We're not for the Olympics coming to Chicago. And I need to make it clear, I am not anti-Olympics. I mean, in 1968, I almost made the Olympic Games. I was an athlete, and I qualified for the Olympic trials. So it's not that we're against the Olympics, but the environment that the Olympics is supposed to come into is supposed to be a game of festivities and where athletes can showcase their talents and all of that. But this, and it's now become a revenue generator for the International Olympic Committee. But the point is, we're talking about Chicago, and we're saying that this city is not ready. It is not the right venue. There are too many things where the people would be sacrificed to host the Olympics, and we're just we're opposed to it.
I got a couple of questions, and I think they're going to go like this. One is whether or not police torture is the same as excessive force, as in the case of this woman who is now saying that the police assaulted her children without provocation in the course of some kind of exchange. And we hear about those kinds of things all the time where citizens are attacked or assaulted, and then they're charged with resisting arrest or disorderly conduct or something to justify the charges. Are we separating the use of excessive force in police matters from torture, or are they part of the same thing? Because we have a lot of misuse of police power in the form of excessive force.
Right.
That's police brutality.
That's police brutality.
Now, the United
That's not torture.
Not necessarily.
Okay.
The United Nations has a definition of torture. Now, to go back a little bit, our group has been to the United Nations. So when we're saying that the United Nations feels this, it's because groups from our group, persons from our group have been over to the United Nations. There is a committee under the United Nations called the
CERD.
Yeah, but there's a CAT, the Committee Against Torture.
Right.
And our group went, and there was a hearing before that, and Stan Williams was over there on that and gave out the information on Chicago. And at the end, they determined, and there are a lot of details we don't need to go into, but they determined that there was torture in Chicago, and in a global sense, Chicago is the United States. So there is torture in the United States through Chicago. And so it's not just something we're saying. Also in the, when he went to Washington, the other group on the committee.
December 12 movement.
Yeah, that's part of the United Nations.
Mm-hmm.
But on the the group with the Americans, Organization of American States, Organization of American States, we went there also and explained what had happened in Chicago. So they also indicated that then there in Chicago there is torture, and we had the rapporteur who from the United Nations who came in.
On racism.
Right, and on racism, and he also made that determination. Now, under the United Nations, they have a certain set of as Pat has indicated, certain things are torture, constitute that level. The police brutality just comes under the shade of that, but it is the same sense, the same situation, but only technically it isn't torture. In fact, pragmatically, it's torture. And there are different degrees of what happens to us as a matter of minorities. Normally I say blacks, but they are also against the Spanish. These Hispanics and the blacks are the victims, because there is a culture in the police in the country. It's the you and us kind of thing, and particularly against the darker skinned people in the country. There's that white supremacy overall umbrella that says you aren't equal to us, we don't respect you. And so when they're beating us, they will then, when it's brought to the attention of the country, of the citizens, the superintendent says, well, okay, if they are proven to have committed this brutality, he'll say, well, we need to have more training. And so every there's these cycles of real brutality, and they keep saying we need to have more training. But if you needed to have more training, white people would also be the subject to brutality. But it happens on the black and Latino areas, and for the same infractions. If you drive through a red light in Chicago on the south side, you could be killed, actually killed, as experience has shown us, but you can certainly be beaten. Now, white people don't get beaten for running through a red light. And in our own personal experiences, I happen to be a lawyer and around other lawyers, and we were discussing it. White lawyers were saying, you know, when they run through a red light, they don't have any fear of this officer. He comes up to them and says, you ran a red light. If we run through a red light, personally, I feel I might come to the end of my life for a violation of a traffic infraction, because I know the historical imperatives that have gone before and the countless people who have been killed, beaten, severely injured just for a traffic infraction who are black. So when you talk about the injustices in our society, there is this injustice that is a part of life, in Chicago, life in the United States. The Kerner report after the King Rebellion said that there are two societies in our country, black, white, and unequal. We're the black that is unequal. Later on, I can tell you some of the solutions as we go into it that I have written about, and I intend to spread out into our society as one of the main solutions. Simply is that the police who beat us up need to go to jail.
Right, because they break the law. But you were asking a distinction in excessive force. See, the terminology is important. Within the police department, they, and by law, they are allowed to use degrees of force to effect an arrest. And they have to abide by a scale, they call it the use of force model. And it goes from mild resistance, where you may touch on certain points. First command is verbal. If you don't get a response, the proper response or the appropriate response, the next could be a slight ushering or assistance. And if you get resistance, then the next could be applying certain pressure at certain points. So it escalates, escalates, escalates. The more resistance you have, the officer has in attempting to effect an arrest, technically, by law, the more force they can use. What has happened in our community, you don't get those levels. It's almost like you're in a car, you know, they advertise cars goes from 0 to 60 in so many seconds, right? Okay, then, well, that's what the police do to us. They go from 0 to 60 in so many seconds, but they don't go to first gear, second gear, third gear. They just go from 0 to 60. And so the excess of force is a term that is used when a police officer uses more force that is necessary to effect an arrest. Now, excessive force can develop into torture, but generally 99.9% on the street, what we get, I'm talking about black people in our communities, that may result in what happened to the latest one, the brother in Oakland, Grant, that is excessive force, and it usually ends up in a death. So you don't really have time to torture anybody. I mean, to me, killing somebody, shooting them in the head, and they don't die, that's torture. But when you kill them, that's execution. So what we have is executions taking place in our community by the police. And as far as I'm concerned, yeah, that's a form of torture, but it's really, in itself, it has its own definition. So no, excessive force and torture really are not the same thing. But our initial contact, technically, our initial contacts will start with abuse, and then it escalates because it's usually verbal abuse, because that's the initial way that people come in contact with each other. When the police come in contact, it's verbal abuse. They call you out your name. And then an individual, especially a young black man, and even women, say, no, you don't have to call me that. I have a name. And then it goes from there. And that can go so fast. And so that's really what we have, and it's almost now it's not even a pattern, it's institutionalized. It's just the way that policing is done in the black community. Our slang has always been, the African American Police League, is that black people are policed and white people are served. That's what that serve and protect is on the car. We don't get none of that. We get the police part. We don't get the serve and we don't get the protect. And there's a difference in how you deal with people when you encounter them. If you're serving them, you deal with them as customers. You deal with them with respect. It's a exchange. But if you are being policed, it's oppression and suppression. And to make sure that you don't rise up, you don't have an opportunity to respond as a human being, or you don't have an opportunity to say, officer, what did I do? Or even Lord knows you don't get an explanation because you're not entitled to one. So that's the difference. But just imagine, what we have every day on a daily basis is excessive, usually goes to excessive force execution, but just imagine torture now is on another level in the sense that it's a prolonged period and it's done to affect a confession, or it's done for punishment. It's not necessarily done to get you, to write a ticket or what have you. It's usually, and I'm not justifying, I'm just saying the circumstances under which it occurs. However, when you see these young brothers on the street, say these officers that are in plain clothes, and they make them all get out the car and lie on the sidewalk, and it's cold, or they'll take them and put them in the summertime, the hood of the car is hot. Right. They'll make them lean on that hood of the car. That's torture. That's torture. But you make them lie on that sidewalk, sometimes they'll pull their pants down. They do it. That's torture. And that's not in any police journal, any book that is in the training academy. That's some television stuff, and that's some stuff that people use because they have the power to do that and to just abuse it because they have no respect for them. So I'm just trying to give you some ideas of what can be this, how you can distinguish excessive force. Because see, that's not force. When I put you on the sidewalk, it's not force. And it's cold outside, that's not force. Pull your pants out, that's not force. But it's torture because you're in a state of discomfort. It is inhumane, and there's a whole list of definitions that define torture under the United Nations. And so we're using the human rights again because United States cannot be relied upon for its police to police itself. How many more years do we have to go through this? So United States is a member of the United Nations when it wants to be. But technically it is a member of the United Nations. So it comes under those guidelines. And so now we're saying this isn't civil rights, this is human rights. This is human rights. It goes beyond the civil rights. And we want our people to think more along that because there are certain rights that all people are entitled to. Civil rights are rights that are given to you by another group of people. So we're not talking about that. We're talking about all the rights that all human beings have and are entitled to because they are human beings.
Inalienable rights.
Right, they're inalienable.
Well, I want to talk about the protect part that you say is absent from our community. I know that as a citizen, as a family man, Sebamurti, you must have a very great interest in protection in terms of just your own children, your own community, being able to live with a reasonable degree of security from harm. I know that that there have been your children have gone to school with some children who have been killed, and they've said it's gang related. Talk about from the point of view of the parents who need the support and the service. How do you look at this?
It's a tragedy because every day children are murdered, and my son attends Julian High School, and my son, who's in Olive Harvey College now, he was in the same grade with Blair Holt, and he knew him, and I've had conversations with his father several times, and the devastation of what our children are facing every single day. When my children go off to school, I have to wonder, will they be coming back home, because it's just that serious. And I look at the news and see how 14 and 15 and 16-year-olds their lives are being taken from them. And it seems like it's always people of our kind that are being taken in large numbers. A lot of it is self-hatred and violence being taken out, that we take out on ourselves from being oppressed. And then a lot of it is execution, where police are executing and killing our children. Matter of fact, another Julian student who was also killed. He was beaten to death with a bat. Not too long after Blair Holt had been killed, and my son knew him when we was looking at the news when they had said that, mentioned his death, and my son just broke out in tears. He said, "I know him. I was just talking to him." So this hits home with me, because my children, they are out there every day facing this, and to see him paining and crying because he just lost a friend who had gotten beaten to death with a bat. And I believe the police were called there, and they just told it was a fight that had taken place, and they had just told them to disperse on, and they really didn't do anything, but they saw that it was still some tension and something still about to take place, and they just allowed it. And I believe it was 2 times that the children all walked out of the school in protest against the violence that was taking place in the community. So it's a devastation and it's a tragedy, and in all practicality, it's a torture that has been visited upon us for so long, for ages. And in talking about the justice of it all and the fairness, every being has a right to be what it was God created to be. And any time that you take that right from them, you are creating the most devastating injustice that can be taken, so that can be perpetrated on them, that they have to live through. And our humanity has been taken from us. It's still being taken from us because we're not denied to express ourselves, as she spoke of, that this is a human rights issue, that our humanity is not being acknowledged. And it is for this reason that we are targeted to just be murdered out in the streets. I saw myself on posted on the internet where this young man was handcuffed, and the police, it was in an L station, and the police officers, they just killed him right there.
Yes.
That's Grant. Oscar Grant.
Shot him right, killed him
And
right
you see
there.
the result of that. A young man just killed 4 police officers in Oakland. I mean, that's a rippling effect because people are pushing back. That city where 4 officers were just killed last month was Oakland, California, who's been really on the brink of serious rebellion since the execution of this young brother.
In
Because
Oakland.
at some point, people are going to push back. But, I think also we need to take some responsibility for our own community. There's a practical aspect to this, and there's an ideological aspect. The ideological aspect is that, yeah, we are human beings and we have a right to live, but there's also something we need to understand about human beings, that human beings have a violent side to them, and certain precautions and things have to be put in place to prevent that. We live in an environment that is so conducive for violence. It actually breeds the violence. And so what we have to understand is we have to attack that environment and remove that which is allowing violence to breed. Our children's mindset, our people's mindset now is to be violent. And I know the focus is on the guns, but I firmly believe if you have the mindset, see, the guns aren't doing the killing. The guns are the instrument that come with a mindset of intent. Because if I really want to kill you, if I don't have a gun, I don't need a gun. I will kill you. And it can be as barbaric as someone getting a hatchet or someone breaking off a bottle and cutting you. It's the mindset. So we need to address that which puts our people in a position where we think that we have to be violent.
But you know, my former guests were talking about the fact that the violence is in the institutions of the nation.
Of course it is.
The government is violent. We are now fighting 1, 2, how many wars?
At the same time.
You know, and so the model for conflict resolution is not to vanquish your enemy or put your enemy in a position where your enemy can no longer threaten you.
It's to take them out.
But it is to completely eliminate your enemy from the face of the earth. That's the Western model.
Yes, it is.
And so that model, I mean, not only do we see the government doing it, but we see it in the movies.
Sure.
You know, the kids go to the movies, and 9 out of 10 movies have violence as the major component, or it's at least a peripheral component of the story, so that people, you know, so that young people have these models before them. They have these examples before them. And then, of course, adults, not just in the movies, but real live adults who have grown up in this culture.
Correct.
Model that behavior before their children. Which we have what kind of divorce rate? This very high divorce rate. We have difficulty in our relationships because we have not been taught, and we have not been encouraged, and we have not had the example from the highest levels down to the most intimate levels of how to relate to each other in a harmonious way.
Which is a culture of violence.
Yes.
And the word,
Also,
the opposite word is culture.
That's right.
Mm-hmm.
But you see, also it starts out when you're 3 to 5 years old with these games.
Mm-hmm.
And I went into a game store, and the sound was just busting over, and the violence of those games where the people were going against each other, cutting off the heads and stomping on them, and blood was sprouting all over. When I was a child at 15, if I had seen that, it would have made me puke. These are little 5, 10-year-old kids, and those are the games that some of the parents are buying for these children, which means they are exposed to such a high degree of violence that I know we all recall at one of the theaters where there was, I guess, a documentary or something where the black people were seriously shot or injured or something, and the whole theater started laughing. Because they laugh when you're seeing these people getting killed in these games. The kids are laughing.
They're
It's
desensitized to it.
Yeah, great, humor. So now they will take that same thing and go and cut your neck off. These 13, 14-year-olds, where all of this, there's so much of this violence is centered, where we as kids never would have thought of it in years past. That's just a precursor to them then doing greater and greater violence as they grow up into that culture that you just described, so that unless we can cut it off, and I believe that we should not permit these games to be permitted to be seen by youngsters. If you grow up knowing that that's possible, we never thought it was possible. If you grow up knowing that that's possible and it's acceptable, then it's reinforced by the news media. It's reinforced by those movies.
And it becomes the norm.
It's the norm.
See, it becomes the norm, and this has been a progression. I mean, I taught
Yes.
school 12 years before I was a police officer for 21 years. And I can recall,
She started as a child.
I can recall relating some of the things that I was witnessing in the schools in the 70s. I taught on the west side, and when I would go home on the south side and relate that, you know what people say to me? Oh, you know, that's just the west side. That's how they are on the west side. When I became a police officer and I was assigned to Cabrini, and I worked there and we did some work, and I was, oh man, we got to deal with this. Oh, you know, that's them folk in Cabrini. That's the way people are in Cabrini. And I'm going like, okay. I said, do you realize that everybody's mobile? Do you realize what's happening over there happens here? And so now everywhere is the west side and everywhere is Cabrini. And I say that to say that there were conditions that existed that allowed that to happen. We used to hear this word, disenfranchised. Disenfranchised meant, you know, that you didn't have certain things. You didn't have money, not money for bling bling. You didn't have money for proper nutrition. You didn't have money for proper housing. You didn't have money for proper recreation. You didn't have proper conditions. You were disenfranchised. So you had to develop a subculture. Sometimes it was not appropriate. It was not acceptable to the next layer because it wasn't a dominant culture, but they fended for themselves. There was a time when within our subculture, the values that existed in our subculture were values that were good values. They perpetuated the good in us. And somewhere we gave that up and says, none of this is any good. We have to attain to reach the values and the standards of the dominant culture. The same dominant culture that founded this country on violence. The same dominant culture that through the history of mankind has never done anything but inflicted violence on people. So now we have surrendered to that. And I was telling my daughter, one of the first schools I taught, it was Taft High School. It was all white school. No African American children in the entire school. And there were only 3 or 4 black teachers, and we had to have superior ratings to be there. I didn't want to be there. And I saw behavior in those children. It was one of complete neglect. But they had money, they had things, they had gifts, they went to vacations in springtime to Bahamas and everywhere. But I saw this violent behavior. They didn't understand right and wrong. And now I'm looking, 30 years later, our children are exactly the same. But we wanted that. We asked for assimilation, we asked for integration, we asked for all of that. So we have it now. You can't have some of it and not all of it. So now we have it. Our children are different from us. We're sitting here saying that. And it has happened in a generation because they have been bombarded by all these things from the dominant culture, and we can't protect them.
Can I break in on that?
We can't deflect it. Sure you can.
Sure. To her point, that subculture that developed.
It's a suppressed culture.
Okay.
Yes, it is.
It's suppressed. It is not sub. Because what you're calling the dominant culture, I would argue, is not a culture at all. What it is a lifestyle. A culture is a holistic thing. A culture is a way of life, and there aren't several. So just to say that what you have is, when you talk about the values that existed, those are African values that were re-emerging in a suppressed culture. Because that's what we've been the victims of ever since we got here, is the culture that we brought with us has been suppressed. And only now and again can it find its outlet, especially in situations where we have nothing to rely upon but that. But this thing that we're calling American culture is not a culture, it's a lifestyle.
I don't see that. I don't see that separation.
Well, I'm just what my main point is. Sub means less than,
or under.
Sub means under.
It's under.
And what I'm saying is, what we have as a people is not less than, it is not under, it is suppressed. Okay. And that's my point.
But to finish my point.
Go ahead.
Okay. That I was saying that she called a subculture has changed now to a counterculture. So it's of equal value as to the culture in the mainstream. But it is a counterculture, and it is a complete reversal. And it is bringing out some of our African culture. But everything that exists in the major culture, where our young people and our older people have been rejected. So then we can look for a job, we can't get it, they say you're not worthy. We try to get it in the schools, you can't get it, you're not worthy. So they say, well, if we can't exist in your culture, then we develop our own. As a result, the mainstream wears a tie. The counterculture doesn't wear a tie. The mainstream speaks English from the English books. The counterculture speaks our own language, all of the other things that come from the southern types of dialects and everything. The fact that we wear our trousers lower.
Some of them.
I'm referring to that group. That's what I'm
Okay.
saying, the counterculture. Actually, we're not part of the counterculture. So she just said they're different than us. They are different than us because we've come through a mainstream type of orientation and acculturation. They have taken this now, and the reason I said the subculture is because it went by degrees. First it was below because we were trying to get there. Now we say, the hell with that. We're flipping it over. We don't need you. So it's just like today, who is the hero? The hero is the guy at the bar who's the bartender. He's not the guy who is, out there doing great things. In school, when I was in school, the guy who made the A's was a hero. Today, the guy who makes the A has to slink off and hide behind the counter someplace because he's going to get his butt beat on the way home, and he can't show that he's bringing the books with him because a part of the counterculture is anti-intellectualism. So the whole thing has turned around. People say, we got to make them change their clothes, We're not going to do that. That is what they have pride in. That's not something that they're ashamed of. And they go to court dressed the same way because they don't recognize that there are certain sophisticated, supposedly, or advanced, civilized places where you're supposed to dress a certain way. So they think nothing of that. They dress like they dress. They think like they think. Pot is a part of it. Gambling, shooting, and to kill somebody now is fun. They drive down the street. They have no reason to the brother's comments here. He's got children that he fears of. I just read there was 540 shootings in our public schools or in our city since January 1st.
I got to get one thing in. I got to get some more stuff on this culture piece because it's important to me enough to ask Sebamurti to speak on that. We maybe have 3 minutes.
Okay, I'll speak a little on culture. I can appreciate you wanting to really make a distinction between culture and society because culture is a way of life and it is rooted in values and it's rooted in what you would see that grows your humanity, where there is growth and there's an expression of your humanity in a non-suppressed way. And there's a lot of things that culture is informed in ways that creates harmony and it building. And there's in the history, just real quickly, during the Dark Ages, when Europeans were separated from the light of ancient Egypt, when they could not connect with the culture that they were using to sustain their existence, they plummeted into nothing because they did not have an authentic culture to build and grow. And that still exists today. They do not have a real culture, and this is why violence has become the way of life here in America, because the dominant group, the dominant society, is merely expressing itself out of the mindset that it has always expressed itself out of, and we've become the victims of that. I like to say this one thing if I can. My son, who's in Olive Harvey, he just got inducted into the in the Honor Society, International Honor Society. And my other son, who's at Julian, he's doing real well too. And I think that as parents, that we can take charge of our children as we manage how much TV they watch, how much violence, and a lot of the ones that are constantly being portrayed in the media as the larger part of our people are ones who have been victimized by parents who have suffered from drug addictions, from and so it gets projected as that is the largest part of what is going on in our community through the media, because they want that to take hold, but it's really
But they're not.
They're not.
They're
Yeah,
a very
we agree
small
with
part of our society, our
That's right.
culture, our people, our race. But because of the design to make us continue to reinforce our inferiority, of course you're going to continue to show those images and make it seem like it's everybody.
Right.
And unfortunately, some of us believe it's everybody,
Right.
and they don't want to be left out, so they want to get with everybody. And to get on TV, you got to act like that because you want to get on Maury Povich or you want to get on Jerry Springer. And back in the day, you wanted to get on Jenny Jones or you want to get on Sally Jesse Raphael. And so you can really look at how this has progressed. And people want to be bigger than life. And so I'm saying all of this is because we don't control the media. We don't control anything that could reinforce the positive things about us. With the way we control it is in our homes, in our neighborhoods, on our
children.
block, and in our families. I mean, my grandbaby lives in a bubble. I mean, a lot of this stuff, she's going like, Nana, what is this? What? And she's 10. However, I have to expose her a little so she won't be eaten by the sharks.
Right.
But the reality is she has a set value system, like my children, they're in their 30s, and they feel like eyeballs. And I'm just saying, even though there may be more like them, the other group is more aggressive.
Well, the other group
It's
is
more
outside.
dominant.
The other group is outside.
And
See,
they're
the good
very
children
aggressive.
are in the house, so nobody can see them in
Yeah.
the first place. And those people, and I want to commend you for having 2 young men. It's rare. Now, I do have to say it's rare for the young black men to be on the honor society. So
That is true.
yeah,
I mean, that's the statistics bear that out.
yeah.
Well,
it
he
is
was
what it
on
is.
the Honor Society, so they got a good role model.
DNA.
And my wife also.
There's another thing, and we don't have the time, but there's a
Documentary.
Durban Review
the Durban
Conference.
Review in for the United Nations that our president is telling us that we shouldn't go into as the United States.
Mm-hmm.
That's another story, but it's a disappointing thing, and we're hoping that we can change that because we thought when Bush was there, you know, that's when he didn't want
Colin Powell and
Powell to
Condoleezza.
go over there and be a part of that.
Mm-hmm.
And now we thought with the president being black, and the world thought with the president being black, we would get into this whole that world global conference against discrimination and all of those
We're
things.
not participating in that.
We're
Obama
not-
has sent a statement that no, the United States will not participate in the Durban Review Conference in Geneva, April
That's
20th through the 24th.
Well,
Yeah.
injustice for all,
Injustice
even
for
on a
all.
global scale.